So we begin chapter 3, the person and chastity, and the section we'll cover today is the first section, the rehabilitation of chastity. So John Paul II begins by talking about the resentment towards chastity that's becoming prevalent. And keep in mind, this is in I think the first edition was 1960 of this book, and he's talking about the situation in Poland. Although I'm sure he had a pulse of what's going on outside of Poland. And right now, it's not just resentment towards chastity, it's outward, not even hatred. It's in chastity almost looked at as a bad thing. People who, for example, are virgins until marriage are kind of looked at, I don't know, like they make fun of them. And so we begin by looking at this attitude that was there in John Paul II's time in Poland in 1950s. So he says, and I'll just quote because it's very to understand, what is resentment? He says, the fact is that attaining or realizing a higher value demands a greater effort of will. So, in order to spare ourselves the effort to excuse our failure to obtain this value, we minimize its significance, deny it the respect which it deserves, even see it as in some way evil. So, because it's hard and we aren't able to attain this virtue, we say, oh, it's not that important or it's not good. So there's a tendency to talk about chastity as something unhealthy, even in a psychological level. And what's even worse is when it's talked about as something that's opposed to love, like you're repressing, these emotions that need to be expressed, and that's against love. And so if love is seen as something, sensual, just emotional and erotic, then of course chastity is going to be seen as the enemy of love. And so, amidst all the confusions of what love is today, and in John Paul II's time, and all the intensity of emotion and sensuality and erotic experiences where we're, mixed up in all of that, it's hard to think soberly about what love is. And when you're feeling all those things, are you truly being attentive to the value of the person? Are you truly attentive to the fact that the other person is a human being with his own interior life and must be treated a certain way, treated with love? Are you thinking about all of that? It's very difficult to discern what our deep attitude towards another person is when all these emotional factors are involved. And so chastity is that special virtue, he says, that protects the true character of love. It prevents love from, being degraded or confused amidst these more spontaneous emotional experiences. The next section is carnal concupiscence. So John Paul II begins this section with a little bit of review. Recall that in the beginning of the book, we started with the discussion of subject and object. When there's two people interacting, for example, if I'm interacting with somebody, I'm the subject and the other person is the object. And the point of that discussion was to point out when the object of our action is a thing, we can use it. But if the object of our thing, if the object of our action is not a thing but a human person, there are certain principles that's involved, and because we can't just use another person, and we have to remember that it is a human person, remember how a person must be treated. So in this section, this review section, he talks about that a little bit in more detail, saying, when there's two people and there's true love between two people, their union grows deeper. And so the two people, even though they're, subjects and objects in their interaction with each other, it feels like the two of them are together, one conjoined subject of action. And so that's how the unity and love leads to. And what's inimical to all that is what's talked about in this section, which is carnal concupiscence. And this is linked to sensuality. And recall when we talked about the psychological analysis of love, We talked about sensuality and sentimentality. Sensuality is the attraction to the sexual values, the bodily characteristic, the sexual characteristics. Sentimentality refers to the attraction, the feeling attracted to the person of the opposite sex, not necessarily about, certain sexual values, but just the overall attraction of male to female or female to male. So sensuality is about the attraction to the sexual values or the body. But concupiscence is something worse than that because it doesn't just describe the attraction we feel. The concupiscence within us makes us actively seek those sexual values, the bodily characteristics and the pleasure aspect. And so there's a desire, carnal desire that comes from our carnal concupiscence. And there's a description in this section of what happens when that desire is there. So I'm feeling that carnal desire, and so that desire gets my will to act, and so I impose myself on the other person, and it makes me seek the sexual values, body and sex, and then that leads to enjoyment of it. So I go for that. I get what I want, and once I get what I want, my attitude towards a person changes because my interest is gone. And so when my desire appears again, this repeats. And so the sensuality, which could be a good thing, it gets expended, it gets used up. And so we don't acknowledge in this whole dynamic, we don't acknowledge the other person really because we're just focused on getting what we want. And this desire just drives us to get what we want. And in all of this, it can even be confused for love because there's something like an amorous experience that can feel like love. And so that's the real danger. It's really focused on getting what I want, but I can still think that it's love. And that whole dynamic is very prevalent. So there's physical intimacy but no real union, and in fact it's opposite of true love. And so this raw material of love, this attraction to the body, which could turn into something more genuine, it just gets wasted and we confuse it with love. On the other side of this is we talked about sentimentality, which is not an attraction to a sexual value or the body or sex, but just a feeling of attraction to the person of the opposite sex. It can seem like this is the answer to this problem, but it's not. It kind of balances out sensuality, but this isn't the answer because, as we've discussed previously, what sentimentality does is leads us to idealize. We think it makes us, when we're attracted to a person, we see that person as far better than he is or she is in reality. Because, again, we're focused on our own emotion in a sense. And it leads to disappointment later. And he says it also leads to erratic behavior, especially in the conjugal life. And so that's an interesting observation. But what is truly a remedy or the right direction to take all this, or the right answer or response to all this, is virtue, the virtue of chastity and integration of love. Acknowledging the personal value of the other person, that must always be present. And so that's what will be a remedy to concupiscence. The next section is subjectivism and egoism. And he starts the discussion by talking about emotion. And because we have feelings, there's always a subjective element in love where I'm, looking at what my experience is, what I feel, and that's going to create the problem of subjectivism. So emotion is something that can develop and adapt according to our will. So if we work at it, then it can turn into something positive. Emotion can help us. we don't have to be a slave to it. It's like fire. We can find ways to control fire and use it in ways that are helpful, and it can be very useful. Or if we just leave it in nature, the wind can just spread it and it can just go crazy. So emotions are kind of like that. Subjectivity is different from subjectivism, which is what this chapter is talking about. Subjectivity just is talking about the fact that there's subjects in love. There's me, and what I feel, what I think. There's a subjective element in love. Subjectivism is when the subjective aspect of love takes over and it goes beyond, its domain. And because there's a subjective element of love that's important too, but when that aspect, that what I feel, what I experience, when that aspect takes over, even dominates, the other aspects of love, the objective aspects of love, that's the problem of subjectivism. And so he breaks it down into two kinds: emotional subjectivism and subjectivism of values. So, emotional subjectivism is when, emotion, becomes too subjective and it skews objective elements of love. So pretty much what it does is it leads us to look to our feelings. How do I feel? Is this authentic? Is this genuine? If I feel that it is, then this is what love must be. This is true love. So, that's emotional subjectivism. And what happens when we get too into this is, disintegration takes place, he says. Emotion takes over and other elements of love loses its value because we're so focused on how I feel. The second thing that happens is emotion becomes a main criterion by which we evaluate an action, rather than objective principles. So again, I only rely on how I feel rather than looking at, what's important and whether other important factors are there. The second type of subjectivism is called subjectivism of values. So emotional subjectivism naturally leads to this. So, pleasure becomes the only value and the only scale by which we measure values. So my value system, it's not based on something that's substantial or real. It becomes more based on whether I get pleasure from it. And so, this would destroy the essence of love, and it would confuse love with pleasurable and amorous experiences. Because even love, I'm looking at it from the perspective of, do I get pleasure from it? So that'll become, what's important to me. Egoism is something that grows from subjectivism. So I become focused on myself, my pleasure. Even when I talk about love, it's all about me. And so, when we're egoistic, when two egoisms are in a relationship, and two people who aren't truly loving each other, but they're just trying to get what they want, there's no true reciprocity. It's not self-giving and receiving somebody else's self-gift. There's no union of persons. He says there's only bilateralism. There's two things kind of existing side by side and trying to work together. There's negotiations and compromises, but what we're trying to do in such a relationship is, maximize pleasure through negotiations and things of that sort. So the two people, they're trying to just get pleasure in their interaction with each other. And they can even think that it's love because as a result of their interaction, they're feeling pleasure. And in fact, a lot of relationships are that way. I want the pleasurable experience. It's less about commitment. It's less about how you should be treated. But, I want a relationship to be such so that I feel pleasure from it. And that's not love. You can think it is, but it's not. And so, the true willing of the good of the other and self-gift, those are far away things from such a relationship. And so, sensuality, the subjectum of values, leads to, egoism because it makes me concerned about pleasure with experiences, especially pleasure with experiences connected with, body and sex. And, emotions also leads to egoism because it becomes about, if this is an authentic experience, then, this is good. And then this is what I want to feel. And feelings become important. So this leads to unchastity, and unchastity, it's not just about those like the explicitly sexual things. You've also probably heard of the term emotional unchastity, and so that's important too. Just not being so attached to the pleasure of emotions. The being attached to the pleasure of the sexual pleasure is obviously unchaste, but even being attached to just the feeling of attraction and pleasantness and all of that, that goes against chastity too. So these subjective elements of love, they're not bad things. This chapter just addressed the dangers of those things when left unchecked, but subjective elements are good things, but you just have to combine it well and integrate it well with the objective elements. So, he says, the author, Pope John Paul II, says, combining the one with the other, the subjective with the objective elements of love, requires a special effort, but this is unavoidable labor if the existence of love is to be assured. So, this is something we have to work at because it is necessary for love. This next section is called The Structure of Sin. And this chapter, it's not talking about explicitly sinful acts, which are probably obvious to those who are doing this study, but really examines what's in the heart and our thoughts and our feelings, kind of internally, what's there, what's going on, and where sin comes into play. So John Paul II introduces the idea of sinful love. And of course, there's no actual thing as sinful love because that's not true love. But what he's talking about is, when we take these raw materials for love, which are good, sensuality, emotion, and we have an experience of love, but rather than that leading to love, we use it in a way where it's not love. So that's kind of where sinful love comes into play. And it's related to the discussion from the last section, which we talked about, the concupiscence. It leads us to, seek others for our pleasure because we're focused on the bodily and sexual aspects. And it takes us to an opposite direction of love. It leads us to ignore the more important aspects of love, the person. And, all this is there because of original sin. But concupiscence by itself is not a sin. It's only, he says, it's a germ of sin. This is because in order for something to be a sin, the will has to consent. I have to actually consciously choose it, consent to it. And I have to voluntarily will the thing that is wrong. And there's a lot that happens, within us that we have no consent over, that we didn't will. He says, in any normal man, the lust of the body has its own dynamic. So lust kind of happens, he says. And this is because as a result of original sin, we have concupiscence. It's a sin when the will consents. I could have a lustful thought or an impulse, and if I consent to it, even the thought, that's when it becomes a sin. If we did not will it, if we don't consent to it, it's not a sin. And you can be easily confused thinking you sinned when you didn't. Okay, just because we felt something or a thought came into us without our desire, without willing it, those aren't sins. We didn't choose that. So, these lustful thoughts and desires, it can be there even if we oppose it firmly with our will. So the temptation surrounding all this, it's not just wrong thinking, because if we're truly ignorant of what's sin and what's not, then, then we're not culpable, even if the thing is bad. But we do have a responsibility to, try to think clearly. I mean, that's the purpose of this study, for example. But, the temptation, it's not just wrong thinking, but what happens with the temptation surrounding, all this is where something's bad, but then we falsify the truth and we say it's not bad after all because, this is pleasant. I feel good, so it's probably not bad because it feels good. And so that's what happens. And the things we discussed previously affect this temptation. Emotional subjectivism. If I feel that something's authentic and good, if I feel that this is genuine, then it must be good. I go up. My will goes after what my emotion tells me. Subjective values. Rather than valuing the more objective elements, I value pleasure. And so if I value pleasure above other things, my will is moved to value it. So that's not good. And so what happens when the will, when I willingly pursue pleasure emotion? The objective elements of love go out the window. Affirmation of the value of the person, willing the good of the other, the union, seeking the common good. These more important things, it goes out the window. And with my will, I'm supposed to kind of resist this pursuit of pleasure from getting excessive. I have to direct it, towards its proper place or keep it in its proper place. But if my will just kind of follows all the emotional desires, carnal desires, then that's when sinful love can come into the picture. We pursue pleasure in the relationship, and when there's mutual pleasure, we can think that it's love, and so this confusion makes it dangerous. So when we're in such a relationship, the the erotic experiences try to retain as long as they can the flavor of love. So even if it's just based on physical pleasure or just emotional pleasure, those types of experiences, it tries to feel like it's love as long as possible. And so that's why there's confusion. If you pause and think about it, you can get to the truth. But when we're pursuing emotion, when we're pursuing pleasure, we don't stop and reflect. We avoid reflection because that would lead to the truth. So the will must be guided by objective truth. We have to go after truth, what is truly good, and we can't. Otherwise, we'll give in to desires that arise from concupiscence. We won't have a clear sense of reality and truth. So love is going to disintegrate. And so this is something we have to work at. Okay, so the last part of the section on the rehabilitation of chastity, the last section of that section is called the true meaning of chastity. Okay. So, John Paul II, in his normal manner, gets, deep into the subject. And, in this section, he gets into chastity. So he ties in all the things we've discussed so far, and you'll see that as I, summarize this section. He begins by talking about how, truth and love has been replaced with a fiction of love, a subjectivist fiction. So we kind of have understanding of what that means by now. So true love has been focused by something that's been replaced with something that's focused on the subject, myself, my how I feel and all that. So in order to understand chastity, love must be understood correctly. So the psychological aspects of love, our emotions, experience of pleasure, and all of that, it must be integrated properly. Otherwise, what we think of as love remains in reality just using of the other person for pleasure, and we've discussed that thus far. So, in discussing what true chastity is, he first begins with a review of Thomistic Aristotelian ethics. So those of you who know a little bit of philosophy, there's four main cardinal virtues, and those four are temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence. So among those four, we're concerned with temperance or moderation. And so that's a virtue that has to do with concupiscence. He says, it restrains the instinctive appetites for various material and bodily goods which force themselves upon the senses. So through our senses, these material goods, these bodily goods kind of impose themselves on our bodies through our senses, through what we feel and sense. And so moderation, that virtue kind of restrains what we do with all of that. Our reason, we can think about and perceive what's good. So we're rational beings that can think. And so through reason, we perceive what's good, not just through our senses or instincts like animals. And so because of that, we can use that to help us to subordinate our sensual reactions. So what happens on a sensual level, we can, not get rid of it, but put it in proper order, perceiving what's better. So the virtue of chastity, falls under moderation. So, it's not about sometimes controlling impulses of concupiscence, or it's not even about just, being good at it, but it's about the habit of it, because the virtue is a habit. So it's effective and constant. So a fully formed virtue, he says, is an efficiently functioning control which permanently keeps the appetites in equilibrium by means of a habitual attitude to the true good determined by reason. So my reason grasps what is truly good, and based on that, I'm able to keep my appetites, bodily appetites, under control. So that's a fully formed virtue. Of course, we're working to fully form it if we're not there yet. But the essence of chastity, the truest sense of chastity, is not moderation. So chastity, it falls under moderation, this virtue of moderation or temperance, but that's not the essential aspect of chastity. So what would be? The answer is love. Okay? So moderation is an integral part of chastity, because without moderation there's no chastity. But the essence is the virtue of love, because the function of chastity is to free our hearts from that utilitarian attitude. It's not just about moderating the desires of concupiscence. So our body wants to seek sexual values, and we want to keep that in control. But keeping that in control, that's not the main part of chastity. The main part of chastity is letting go, freeing ourselves from the tendency to use the other person for our pleasure. Okay? So you must control not only sensuality and carnal concupiscences, but he says more importantly, those centers deep within the human being, which the utilitarian attitude is hatched and grows. So deep within our hearts, which is where that utilitarian attitude can grow, stay and grow, that's what we have to get rid of. So when we think of chastity, don't just think about saying no to sinful impulses. Think primarily about that thing deep within our hearts that wants pleasure, that wants to use other people, letting go of that. Think of that in terms of chastity. It's that desire for pleasure, wanting to use others. That attitude can be hidden so easily because we can, justify it. It feels good, so it's right. And we're both enjoying each other, so it's right. That's what makes it all the more dangerous, because we're doing the opposite of love when we think that it's love. And this all ties into what we've talked about. And we see this type of attitude prevalent in our world. Like we experience pleasure and think it's good, and we defend it. So chastity, it means, he says, interior transparency, or I guess purity. But yeah, he uses the word transparency. So we must be free from that desire to use and enjoy. It does not mean banishing or suppressing desires for the sex or the body or pleasure, because our desire for sex or desire for the body, those are God-given desires that are good. Suppressing them just means it's gonna, explode sometime. So it's not about repressing it or getting rid of those desires, but taking those desires and raising them to the personal level and integrating them into true love. It's not saying no, these desires are bad. It's not saying that these desires are more important than the more objective elements. We want to think of the person first. They're good, willing they're good, and making ourselves a gift to that other person, uniting our wills, and that first, and then the body, the desire for the body, the pleasure, that comes under that. So it's not about no's. We can think of chastity and even other virtues as just saying no. But whenever we say no, it's not about a no, but it's about the greater yes. Okay, what are we saying yes to? That's far greater. And when we say yes to that, yes involves saying no to some things. But it's this greater yes. What is that? That's what chastity is about. So it's a difficult long-term matter. And so he says we have to wait patiently for it to bear fruit. It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lot of work over a long time. But he says this is the sure way to happiness. And we look for happiness in this area of love in so many wrong ways. But this, he says, is the way to happiness. Working long term to free our hearts from that utilitarian attitude, from that attachment to pleasure only. And so he concludes his section with a discussion about humility and about God. So humility is the proper attitude before any greatness. Remember, for example, Peter, when all that fish came, he realized it was God. He says, "Depart from me, I'm a sinner." And so he talks about the humility of the body before great things. So when there's this great vision of love in this other person, the body has to be humble. It's not about my pleasure, the body's pleasure. So in the face of happiness, when confronted with the question of happiness, the body has to realize happiness consists a lot more, something far greater than the bodily experience of pleasure. That can be a small part of it, but the essence of it is something far greater. And so when we're humble and we can purify our hearts of those things, that's what leads to union with God. He quotes that beatitude, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." So imagine a heart that's free from that desire for pleasure only, or the selfishness and using the other person. When we're free from that, our hearts are pure. That's what leads to the vision of God.